This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. When you visit the doctor, you probably hand over your insurance, your ID, and contact details. It's just one of the many places that has your personal info. And if any of them accidentally expose it, you could be at risk for identity theft. LifeLock monitors millions of data points a second. If you become a victim, they'll fix it, guaranteed, or your money back. Save up to 40% your first year at lifelock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
$1 million, free to play. You just need to survive. It's the Fanatics NFL Survivor Pool. Pick one team to win each week. Get it right, move on. Get it wrong, you're out. The last fan standing take home a guaranteed $1 million cash prize. And for every player who joins, we add $1 to the pot, up to $10 million. The Fanatics NFL Survivor Pool. Play free on the Fanatics app. App access open to all. Must be 21 plus and joined by 9/8 to play. No purchase necessary, U.S. only, void where prohibited. Subject to complete terms. See fanatics.com/game rules.
Ah, Smart Water. Pure, crisp taste.
That's really good water.
It's the kind of water that says, I have my life together.
I do feel more sophisticated.
Smart Water. For those with a taste for taste. Grab yours today.
Once upon a time, William F. Buckley was a household name. He ran a successful magazine. He was on Firing Line, a popular PBS TV show. He was sought out for his views on anything and everything. Today, well, it's been quite a while since he passed on in 2008. His magazine, National Review, isn't as influential as it once was, but Buckley is still a fascinating figure. Hello, and welcome to the Full Comment Podcast. My name's Brian Lilly, your host, and today a look at a recently released biography of William F. Buckley. It's called Buckley, The Life and the Revolution That Changed America, because at its heart, Buckley was a revolutionary and someone who started a movement that continues to change politics in America and, by extension, Canada through to today. I had a chance to sit down and speak with Sam Tanenhaus, former writer and book editor for the New York Times. He's written extensively elsewhere and is the author of several books, including a biography of Whittaker Chambers. Here's our conversation. So, Sam, you've written a very big book. It's over 900 pages about William F. Buckley. And while he is a very familiar name for me, someone whose writings I read vociferously as I was, altering my political mindset, a lot of people are just sitting there saying, who is William F. Buckley today? He used to be very popular. He was one of the most popular guys going, part of, at the center of the zeitgeist. Who's William F. Buckley in a nutshell, and why did you have to write a biography of him?
In a nutshell, Brian, he was the architect of the modern conservative movement in the U.S. And that's not to say he wasn't a president like Reagan or even a nominee like Barry Goldwater or Mitt Romney, or name them. But he was a writer. He was a television personality. He was the moderator of the first really great TV debate program and in the U.S. And I'll meet all sorts of, no offense to anybody, slightly older people who will remember his show Firing Line extremely well. And I urge listeners, just go on YouTube and type in a name. Type in Muhammad Ali or Groucho Marx and William F. Buckley, and you'll see him. And he was born in 1925, died in 2008 at the age of 82, which means in November his centennial will be celebrated. I think that will bring some more attention to him, but you never know with, what do they call it now, the attention economy, whether that's really going to happen. But he was an author, he was a debater, he was a columnist, a television personality, and, Brian, an impresario, an organizer. He brought all sorts of people together in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, right? Those mid-century decades to take a marginal movement in the U.S. of conservatism, of ideological conservatism, take over the Republican Party, and then dominate our politics with the result, some would say, we are seeing right now.
We'll get into how it relates to right now in a little bit, but people forget, or maybe not old enough to have known this, but the Republican Party used to be rather middle of the road, some would say liberal, very much Northeastern establishment. And then Bill Buckley came along. He was responsible in part for Barry Goldwater as the presidential nominee in '64, for Richard Nixon in '68. I won't give him any credit for Ford unless you want to give it to him. But Ronald Reagan, he had a big part in Ronald Reagan's ascendancy. Reagan was big by '80 anyway, but.
Buckley was a mentor to Reagan in a way. He wasn't so much for Goldwater as one of the discoveries I've made. But Buckley, through his magazine, National Review, which was founded in 1955 when Buckley was 29, first a weekly and then, in the elegant old phrase, a fortnightly. Maybe you still say that in Canada. You all speak better than we do here in the U.S., which means it came out every 2 weeks. That became the flagship publication for conservatism in the United States. You've made a really important point, Brian, which is that we have to separate out, though it seems inconceivable today, but going back in time, the conservative ideological movement from the Republican Party. And the Republican Party is closer to what you've described. It was a kind of moderate, middle of the road, the party of businessmen, because that's what they mainly were. And the Democrats were the party of the New Deal, of social reform, social justice. And the Republicans were the rump party. They were just out of power from Buckley's childhood in 1928 until the election of Richard Nixon in 1968. No true blue conservative was elected president of the United States. There were a couple of moderate figures. Dwight Eisenhower, the great general in World War II, was a moderate Republican, but not ideological conservatives. So what Buckley and company did was to choose a couple of very big issues and put them front and center. And the most important was militant anti-communism, starting at the beginning of the Cold War and in the late 1940s.
What was it that drove his anti-communism? Because I know you talk about his relationship with Joe McCarthy, McCarthyism. He wasn't really into McCarthyism, but he also didn't, throw McCarthy under the bus the way so many people did.
Yeah, a lot of it had to do with religion. Brian Buckley was a really devout Catholic. So let me do a little bit on his background, because it's what sets him apart from so many others. So I mentioned he was born in 1925. He was the sixth of 10 children in a quite wealthy family that grew up on a big estate in Connecticut, near the border of Massachusetts, just to the north, and Dutchess County, New York, to the west. I mention that because when Buckley's father, who was a self-made oil millionaire, was launching his crusade against the Bolshevik Franklin D. Roosevelt as he saw him, that was their neighbor. Roosevelt was living 30 miles away, and they would see him at the horse show. So it's very much a kind of inside the establishment attack on the establishment. And that's what was new. That's what made it sound different. You always had people out there in the heartlands who didn't like the political establishment. But Buckley went to Yale University, was the star of his class, the editor of the newspaper. His family had all this money. They lived in 47 acres. They had another mansion in South Carolina with black help. I have a lot on that in the book, some of the discoveries I made. So it made him a kind of insider declaring war on the elite. It's not so different from what we're seeing today in our politics.
When I first remember seeing William F. Buckley, when I was first reading him, you would think that this guy came from central casting for the Northeastern Anglican aristocracy, that he'd been a blue blood for his whole time, and instead his ancestors came from Ireland. They went to Hamilton, Ontario, my hometown, then went to Texas and made a bucket load of money that helped Buckley throughout his career. It was a very different background than you would expect for someone like him.
Yeah, what was interesting, I found, Brian, there's a funny theme that runs through the discussion of politics in the 1960s with the rise of the very charismatic John F. Kennedy, who was elected in 1960, is people began to notice what seemed to be parallels between the Kennedy family and the Buckley family. They're Irish, they're Catholic, they're really rich, they're very good looking. All the boys go to the Ivy League, right? Harvard or Yale. And there are a lot of daughters who have many children, and it feels like these two clans. But Buckley was always very snobbish about the Kennedys. And he'd say, well, they're kind of, lace curtain Irish. We never paid any attention to Ireland, he told me. Everything for us was Mexico, where his father had made his fortune from growing up in South Texas and then migrating there, and the South. There were very much Southerners, the American South. Buckley's mother came from a German-Swiss family in New Orleans. What that meant, this is really important, Brian, is that not only were both his parents devout Catholics, they came from places where Catholicism dominated. So they did not have the inferiority complex a lot of, say, Irish immigrants did in the U.S., right? No Irish need apply.
Mm-hmm.
That was not an issue, as I think it was for quite a while in Ontario and Toronto. Particularly, hey, I've read my Morley Callahan, and there was this, there's a WASP kind of very Protestant elite, and the Catholics are excluded from that. Well, that was true in the U.S. too, except the Buckleys' origins were in these really, really Catholic places. We should mention, by the way, that Buckley's socialite wife, Pat, came from Vancouver. People should know that. She came from our super rich, far richer than the Buckleys, family in Vancouver, the Taylors. And there are people in Canada who will remember the names A.C. Taylor. That was her father, and her brother was also called A.C. Taylor. Hugely successful financiers in Canada. So there's a whole Canada, North America thing going through here, too.
Also, as you're going through some of the names there, it's remarkable to me how many of the people who were at the center of shaping conservatism in the United States over the last bunch of decades have been Catholic, like Buckley or the people behind First Things, and all of that. It's been an incredible influence, but it's not seen as that way. Would Buckley, someone who used National Review, used his show Firing Line to put forward conservative ideas, to make them mainstream to the point where Ronald Reagan is elected in a landslide, would he recognize the conservative movement that he sees today? Or, would you even say that what is around Donald Trump and MAGA, which is something very different, would he recognize any of that or see that as the antithesis of what he was building?
He would see some of it, I think. What the economic policies will set aside. Now, Buckley was an old-style, laissez-faire, Reagan type, what's now called neoliberal. Free trade, no barriers, everybody let's get as rich as we can. And here's where he'd agree with Trump, the lowest possible tax rate on the wealthy, right? Which Reagan did. Reagan first reduced the taxes. Trump is doing it even more. And there's another place where he'd agree with Trump, I believe. No one can say these things with certainty, right? Buckley died in 2008, and we can't possibly predict what he would say now. But what he might recognize is the culture war aspect. Buckley's first book, which put him on the map and made him quite famous at the tender age of 25, was an attack on his alma mater, Yale University, called God and Man at Yale. And I know just from some chatting you and I have done, you're aware there's a lot has been written about my book as it's come out in the U.S. And whenever the discussion turns to Buckley's 50 books, they talk about only one of them, his very first one, God and Man at Yale, because it's an attack on the Ivy League or the ivory tower from within. What did Buckley advocate? Fire left-wing professors, and alumni and donors should stop giving money to the university. Pretty much what's going on now.
Yeah, with
That's
Columbia,
the culture war. Yeah.
With Columbia and other schools. And
Columbia, Harvard, and others. University of Virginia just fired its president. And the idea there is that a small cadre, we use the old communist term. It's not a Buckley's first mentors were ex-communists, right? You have a small group of elites who have kind of hijacked these great institutions and are espousing ideologies that then convert or seduce the sons. In Buckley's day, women were not admitted to these universities. That didn't happen till 20 years later in the late 1960s. The sons of, as he says, Christian and God-fearing businessmen are being turned into atheistic socialists. That's his argument. And the argument is outlandish and extreme, although quite cleverly and brilliantly stated. But here's where he scored his big points, Brian, and I think it's where it's happening again today. What he got was not so much that there were terrible things going on. Most people would say, well, sure, you're going to have economists who think the New Deal kind of worked in the 30s. Why should they not teach students that? Or with the rise of the natural sciences, we don't accept the Bible as revealed truth. What's the surprise there? Well, what Buckley knew was that what was going on in the classroom, the things I've just described, was something the administrators of those universities were actually kind of shielding the donors and alumni from. Right? They still assumed Yale in 1950 was the university it had been in 1900, in a kind of a Victorian institution, which in itself had not changed all that much from its founding 200 years earlier. So Buckley's saying we've entered modernity, and modernity is dangerous, and worse, the people who run the institutions won't own up to it. So now we flash forward to what's going on when people in Congress, U.S. House of Representatives, attack the presidents of universities, put them in they put them on. They interrogate them, they put them on display, they ask them these questions. Well, what are you doing about anti-Semitism? Is it true faculty have signed these petitions? Is it true that Jewish students feel intimidated and the university professors don't know what to say because either they're not really paying attention or they're going to be taken someplace they don't want to go to? So Buckley's phrase for that was unacknowledged orthodoxy. If you've got a new philosophy that you're teaching the students, just come out and say it. But they weren't saying it, and that's where the points got scored.
So he would recognize the outrage over the anti-Semitism on campus and the culture wars around that. I know that you write about he kind of wrote the playbook, as you said, by telling the donors not to go on. Was he an establishment conservative when he started out, or was he a radical?
He started out as a radical. He called himself a radical conservative. And, it's a funny phrase because people say, well, how can you be a conservative who wants to preserve things and then call yourself a radical? And the answer to that, which took me a while to find, that's why these books take a long time, is that if you think the enemy has taken over, well, the only way you're going to get rid of them is through the root and branch, pulling it up. So you become the champion of conservative values in his estimation. I'm not saying, by the way, that I agree with any of it. My job as the storyteller is just to guide a reader through it. So if you have that view, you're going to say, well, they've really come after us. They have really attacked our ideals, our values. We have to fight back. We have to be aggressive in turn. We can't meekly go along with it. And that's where the more traditional Republican Party didn't seem to be meeting the challenge, because they would say, well, we're conservatives, and as long as there's not rioting in the streets, we're going to make the adjustments we need to make, and we'll be okay. Buckley says, no, you can't do that, that you're giving up more than you realize. And you've got to get it back, or it's never going to come back. So he had this kind of enthusiasm and this zeal, for converting people and bringing them along to the cause, finding all the different platforms, whether it's the debate stage, whether it's television, whether it's books, whether it's columns, whether it's the magazine he publishes, all these things he's doing at once to build this movement in opposition. And let me add one thing to that. You mentioned McCarthyism before, Brian. Buckley's second book, also controversial, was a defense of Joseph McCarthy called McCarthy and His Enemies. He wrote it with his best friend at Yale, who became his brother-in-law, Brent Bozell. Well, if you read that book, which I've done very closely, there's not a whole lot about McCarthy in it, as you were kind of suggesting, but there's a lot about his enemies. It's a lot about a lot of it's about the bad guys. And who are the enemies? They're in media and they're in academia, just as we hear today.
Um, I heard a clip where he was talking about that book and about McCarthy, and he said, "Yeah, as bad as McCarthy was, his enemies were worse."
That's it. Yeah, that
What's
was always the line. Yeah.
to use a term that you used in both your essay and your book, "The Death of Conservatism." This is from, what is it, 2009, 2010 era.
Yeah.
You were writing about, the death of the conservative movement after George W. Bush was done, after John McCain had lost to Barack Obama, and you talked about a divide within the movement. And you said that there were these revanchists who don't trust government. Kind of sounds to me like Bill Buckley started as a revanchist. He didn't trust the establishment and wanted to pull it out, by the root.
Yeah, he did. He did. And here's the interesting thing is, and again, draw the current parallels. And thank you, by the way, for bringing up that book of mine, which had kind of been forgotten and made fun of in part because of the title. Although now I see, particularly on the right, I was surprised to see this. It's being discussed again because conservatives are trying to figure out where Trump fits in. And in this very moment, right, we're talking at the midst of this crazy Jeffrey Epstein crisis or controversy or scandal or hilarity, however you view it. Now you have the paradox of the outsiders becoming the establishment. What do you do? What do you do when your guy who's been railing against the Justice Department in the U.S. for concealing all this evidence now runs the Justice Department and tells you they're not going to release the documents, right? Then you get to this place Bill Buckley did where he's on the outside all these years, and then OMG, his 2T Ronald Reagan is one of the most popular presidents in U.S. history. Not only that, Reagan kind of starts acting like more, you can't see air quotes, more normal kind of president. He wants to scale back the Cold War. He actually reaches a kind of truce with the Soviet Union. They finish it off. He doesn't really eliminate all the social programs, the big spending programs they say he's going to eliminate. None of that's really happening. And he doesn't really denounce his enemies that much. And you're thinking, well, how did that happen? Well, it happened because he was a responsible leader once he came into office. And now we're actually seeing some repudiation of that, maybe. This may be the first time, although, there will be different interpretations of this, where we may actually see an insurgent in the White House. And that's why he's getting caught out, because he's supposed to, his followers, some of them, expect him to follow through on this stuff that suddenly isn't getting followed through on so much.
Yeah, and they're quite loud. Just to, while you're mentioning or alluding to Donald Trump, both men have a connection, Buckley and Trump, at least through one person, Roy Cohn, who was Trump's mentor, was a great friend of William F. Buckley.
You've picked up on that. There's one mention. As you said, it's a very long book. Although I want listeners to understand, it's meant to be fun to read, and many who've read it have said so. It moves quickly. Buckley had a very busy, active life. He did all kinds of crazy stuff, frankly, incredible things, as one reviewer said. So Trump is mentioned in just one place, and that is when he and Bill Buckley were character witnesses for Roy Cohn when Cohn was threatened with disbarment and was disbarred near the end of his life. So they say, well, why would Buckley have such affection for Roy Cohn? Well, Cohn had been the chief assistant to Joe McCarthy. Buckley had known him from that period in the 1950s. And Buckley was a really loyal guy. He was loyal to his CIA friend, E. Howard Hunt, right through the Watergate crisis. Buckley's covering up for him and withholding information that he knew about the Watergate break-in, which was a huge scandal. It makes Jeffrey Epstein's scandal look pretty small. And Buckley was very loyal. So he was loyal to Roy Cohn. What surprised me, Brian, is when Buckley testified before the judicial panel that was weighing Cohn's many egregious, grievous acts as a lawyer, Buckley said, "I can't imagine how Roy Cohn would ever do anything untoward," when Buckley knew that Cohn had done it to his own friends. He'd promised them money that he didn't give them, or he'd write bad checks, this kind of thing. And Buckley knew it, but he went before this panel and pretended he didn't know it.
But his friends were legion, and he was not someone who, we've talked about him so far as this, father of the modern conservative movement in America. But politics, and he founded National Review, which is still a great publication in my eyes, but he was about more than politics, and his friendships transcended political lines.
That's one of the fun things about him, is all who his friends were. Well, the publisher, longtime publisher of National Review, Bill Rusher, said, Buckley was a good writer, as you know. You've read a lot of the stuff. And he really admired good prose whenever he read it. And he knew when people wrote better than he did, and then he really esteemed them. His favorite writer was Norman Mailer, who was, the novelist and journalist who was very much on the left, and he and Buckley were great friends. Well, Bill Rusher said at one point, the publisher of National Review, he said, "It's a good thing the Communist Manifesto wasn't better written, or we might have lost Buckley."
He just liked good writing that much?
He liked good writing that much, and he liked the people who could do it. So he'd invite them over to his house. He had these beautiful homes, and one of them in Stamford, Connecticut, right on the Long Island Sound. That was his weekend home. He had this beautiful, elegant apartment in Manhattan that was that he and his wife Pat was a great socialite and a great donor to AIDS research and protection of gay men in the 1980s. In fact, she kind of overtook her husband as a moral force in that period. Very highly respected and esteemed philanthropist. Buckley was very philanthropic too, by the way. But so they have these beautiful homes and their winter retreat in Gstaad, Switzerland, where you would see Princess Grace Kelly and the film star David Niven. I mean, it's almost comical what this life was like. And that really mattered more to Buckley in the end, I think, than the politics did. He was really good at politics. He told me, but he hated talking about it. So when I went to see him, I was working on this book, and I got to know him because he was a gatekeeper for a previous biography I'd written of one of his heroes, the ex-communist witness, Whittaker Chambers. And Buckley said, "I only talk about politics when I'm paid to do it." And he was paid a lot to do it. Otherwise, it was, did you see what was in the New Yorker this past week? Did you see that story by John Updike? Isn't he good? Isn't that great? Or what about this gossip about what's going on in the boardroom at the New York Times? He was very much inside that media world. The media elite that's consistently denounced today, those were Buckley's friends. He got together with them all the time, and he took them on his boat. He was a big sailor. At one point, he owned 2 big sailing boats at once, and he really couldn't afford either one. He was always on the verge of bankruptcy. So I have a lot on that too, because I found it all interesting how he led this huge and busy, active life. He just never slowed down. One of the key documents I had, which no one else had ever seen, is his personal diary from about 30 years, from 1968 to the year 2000. And it's just a list of his appointments each week, what he's doing every single day, kept by one of his 2 secretaries. And you just can't believe it. It's like a Monty Python routine. How many people are coming in? Henry Kissinger over here and Joan Didion over there. And, we have to meet with the president. And it's just the United States.
It would sound like a lot of name dropping.
And, so much name dropping. If you read his memoirs, I have a feeling you've read them, Cruising Speed and Overdrive. The names just fall in these huge cascades.
But these were just his friends.
They're his friends. And we have to say, somebody who cultivated friendship. I don't know how many of your listeners remember the name Alistair Cooke, who's a great Manchester Guardian journalist who came to the United States kind of before Christopher Hitchens. He was doing the Christopher Hitchens thing. Came to the United States and wrote very brilliantly about what was going on in American politics and culture for what was then called the Manchester Guardian, and now we call it the Guardian. Well, and he was also on public television, and he introduced every week something that in the U.S. we called Masterpiece Theater, which were BBC costume dramas. And he did this in the 1970s and 80s. And Buckley got to know him pretty well. And he said to me, he said, I have lunch with Alistair Cooke every 3 months. It's just put into his calendar. And you think, you have lunch with somebody every three months? Why would you do that? Well, I put to you, I wish I could do it. And I put it to your listeners. Imagine if you saw someone for an hour and a half, once every 3 months, over the course of, say, 10 years. You would think of that person as a true friend, as somebody you really knew, because you're making a point of seeing them. When I was starting out at this stuff, I was nobody from nowhere. Now I'm an older nobody from nowhere. But then I was a younger nobody from nowhere. And I was working on this biography of Whittaker Chambers, and Buckley would call me out of the blue. How are you doing? Can I help you with anything? He would initiate it. And at that point, now we're talking about the early 1990s, when Buckley was still on television, and his protege, Reagan, had just been elected president, and Buckley's good friend from Yale, George H.W. Bush, is the next president. That's the world Buckley's living in. If you stood in front, I used to work at the New York Times. I was a writer and a reporter and editor there. If you stood in front of the New York Times, I used to tell my colleagues, and a lot of famous people walked by, a lot of famous writers. I mentioned Norman Mailer. If he walked by, how many people would recognize him on the street? I'm guessing maybe 2 out of 10. Or if Joan Didion, the famous Joan Didion, walked by, maybe 3 out of 10. If Bill Buckley walked by, everybody would recognize him. That's how famous he was. Because he was on television every week. He was on it for 30 years. You know.
And it was a good-sized audience watching Firing Line.
It was PBS, public television. So the numbers were never huge, but it's in 100 markets, as we now say. And you can't see the air quotes again, it's the right people watching it. That is to say, it's the people who read, the people who really are engaged in politics.
We need to take a quick break to pay the bills, but more with Sam Tanenhaus and his book on Buckley in a moment.
You're tuned into Auto Intelligence, live from Auto Trader, where data, tools, and your preferences sync to make your car shopping smooth.
They're searching inventory.
Oh, yeah.
They find what you need.
They're gonna find it.
You can make a budget for your wallet to help you succeed. Pricing's precise and true.
So true.
It's smarter car shopping.
Ooh.
Just for you.
Oh, it's just for you.
Ooh.
Find your next ride at autotrader.com. Powered by Auto Intelligence.
Talk about stepping up. Bang! Bang!
It's time to level up your game. Introducing the all-new ESPN app. All of ESPN, all in one place. Your home for the most live sports and the best championship moments.
The electricity is palpable.
Step up your game with no annual contract required. It's the ultimate fan experience. Level up for more on the ESPN app or at stream.espn.com. Sign up now.
Claptrap here. 2 big things are coming this fall. Borderlands 4 and Spotify Wrapped. So stop listening to that one playlist that reminds you of your ex who only made you cry. Talking about you, Veronica. And pre-order Borderlands 4, coming out September 12th.
Rated mature. This is Tristan Hopper, the host of Canada Did What?, where we unpack the biggest, weirdest, and wildest political moments in Canadian history you thought you knew until you what really happened. Stick around at the end of the episode to hear a sample of one of our favorite episodes. If you don't want to stick around, make sure you subscribe to Canada Did What? Everywhere you get podcasts.
Let me ask you about his, the way he was able to change and adapt. You mentioned earlier that his family came out of the South, that he would spend a good part of the summers when he was growing up in South Carolina. That informed his views on race. And at the beginning, he was in favor of segregation. He was not by the end. Talk to me a bit about that and the famous Muhammad Ali interview on firing line.
Yeah, one of the great things about Buckley was his ability to adapt. And it's interesting because it's not a matter of splitting the difference, right? Like we talk a lot, we look back at that era, 1950s and 60s in the US, and we say, well, that was the peak period of consensus politics, right? That's when you have this great civil rights legislation that much of the country supports. The anti-communism, for better and worse, the country supports. It gets us into Vietnam, which kind of, to somebody my age, was a single great calamity in U.S. history. It tore the country apart. Well, Buckley had very firm views, but he could also see when he was losing. And if it wasn't going to win, he liked to win. He as a kid, he was very competitive. He runs the newspaper at Yale because he outcompetes everybody for it. When he was a young horseman, an equestrian, he competed at Madison Square Garden in the National Horse Show because he won the local competition. He was a brilliant student when he was very young and then became less interested in it, but he liked to win. And if his side wasn't going to win, then he was going to find some other thing to do. And after a while, because also, this was so important, and we've touched on it, because his own range of experience kept getting bigger and bigger, he would meet people who defied his presumptions about them. And that's a great thing when you can do that. So you mentioned Muhammad Ali and race. Well, we start with Buckley, as you say, in the 1950s, one of the big finds I made in the research, probably the most important discovery I made, was not something Bill Buckley gave me, it was something he actually hid from me, which is important when you're doing biography for all you researchers out there. And it wasn't in his huge archive at Yale. It was in another little archive in South Carolina where his family had a home. And I'd picked up one little reference in National Review to the town where the Buckley family spent its winters, in Camden, South Carolina. Something had happened there. And I think, well, what's that about? So my wife and I go down to Camden, South Carolina, go into the archive, and what do we find? That there was a pro-segregation newspaper the Buckley family had sponsored. And I can tell you...
Was that him, or was it his father, or was it all of them?
His parents owned it. So they paid for the staff, they paid for the equipment. His older sister, Priscilla Buckley, who was one of the best text line editors of her time, as we say. This is somebody who edited copy by Joan Didion and Gary Wills and writers of that caliber, was for a time the editor of that newspaper, edited it out of her office in New York. And nobody knew about it. In the South, they did. You could see references to the Buckley family newspaper, the Camden News, in the Southern press. But this goes back long ago, to mid-1950s, where mass communications had not reached the saturation point it has today. So Buckley could kind of keep that secret, and did keep it secret for a really long time. He himself was not involved in it, but there were causes that National Review, having to do with things like voting rights, keeping Black Americans from voting, that were identical to the positions being advanced in the Camden News. So Buckley is, and I was just amazed when I'm working on the book and I typed the phrase Northern segregationist, and I think, have I ever seen that phrase before? Because it just makes so little sense. But here you have these very erudite, thoughtful conservatives in the North, where there was not legalized segregation, actually siding with the South, as they called it, by which they meant the power structure in the white South. Well, what happens? Buckley ran for mayor. His one campaign, a hilarious, kind of wonderful campaign he waged in 1965 to become the mayor of New York City, to try to save the Republican Party after the calamitous defeat in the federal national election of their candidate, the rights candidate, Barry Goldwater. And the movement looks finished. There's been a huge landslide victory for the Democrats and Lyndon Johnson. And the party, the Republican Party, taken over by the conservative movement, looks as if it's going to become a fringe party, totally out of power. So Buckley runs for mayor of New York to try to revive it. It turns out to be this very charming and and beguiling and persuasive candidate, especially on television, where he's just instantly the charisma on television just transforms him, his celebrity, and the movement. Well, what happens when he's running for office? He starts meeting more black people who aren't like the ones who just work for his family and their 2 estates in Connecticut and South Carolina. They're actually middle-class professionals, and suddenly he realizes they don't sound the way he expects them to. Then he starts firing line, and he thinks, okay, I've got to talk to these people. So it's kind of interesting for Americans now, or anybody now who wants to know about black militancy in the late 60s, which has become a big theme, the Black Panthers and such. I'm actually working on some of that now myself. They were all on firing line. Buckley invites them in. Go ahead, Huey Newton, the Minister of Defense for the Black Panther Party, who poses with a machine gun. Go ahead and tell me what you believe. And he brings Muhammad Ali on. Why does he like Ali? Because Ali's got moral courage. He's giving up his heavyweight crown because he doesn't want to fight in the Vietnam War. So Buckley invites him on. And at this point, 1967, 1968, I know this, I was a kid then, and I would read the New York Times, and its esteemed sports writer refused to call Ali Muhammad Ali. So, well, that's just some radical name. He's really Cassius Clay. And he insisted in the newspaper that's what he would call him. Buckley has him on his program, and the first thing he says is, well, we're going to call you Muhammad Ali. And if you change your mind tomorrow and decide you're Cassius Clay, then we'll call you Cassius Clay. In other words, you get to decide who you are, right? Well, we add another piece to this, which was a fascinating and devastating debate Buckley had with James Baldwin, the great writer in Cambridge. And Baldwin just dismantled Buckley.
And explain who Baldwin was and why this mattered to Buckley.
Baldwin had become, in the mid-1960s, probably the most famous Black author in the world, certainly in the United States, through his fiction, which was quite admirable, but really through a little polemic called The Fire Next Time, which is a very small book. It's just barely 100 pages. It's really 2 essays he wrote, one of them published in The New Yorker. And Baldwin says, basically, Black people aren't going to take it anymore. It's the beginning of what we think of as the Black Power movement. Buckley, the Southerner, is horrified by this, and he really wants to take Baldwin on. And so Cambridge University invites them to debate in England. Baldwin was doing a promotional tour for his novel, a very good novel called Another Country. He's touring Europe. It's coming out there. Buckley's on his skiing vacation in Switzerland. They invite them for a BBC televised debate. You can see it on YouTube, listeners. Go on, you'll see it. You'll see Buckley and Baldwin. And Buckley comes across as this kind of snarling white supremacist, which he wasn't really, but that's what it sounds like. And Baldwin stands up with all the skills of the former boyhood preacher he had been in Pentecostal churches in Harlem and delivers this kind of glorious, impassioned autobiography of Black people in America. And Buckley is fighting against it at the very moment, February 1965, when Black citizens in the Deep South are being brutalized by the police because they're trying to exercise their constitutional right to vote.
So in all your research, I mean, you said that Buckley hid the paper from you, and you met with Buckley many times about this book. After your Chambers book, you met with him many times to talk about this book. And but do you get the sense from all your research that he was a racist? Was it just the way that he was brought up? And then, whatever your answer is, tell me how he gets from there to having Jesse Jackson on firing line and really helping that guy start his public figure career.
I'm glad you brought that up because he loved Jesse Jackson. He met him on a tour Buckley, and I'm so glad you're a good interviewer because you know how to ask the questions, is after he had Muhammad Ali on his program. And by the way, when Ali is on firing line, it's worth watching because he and Buckley then have a debate about Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam. And it's fascinating. Buckley takes Malcolm X's side. And because Muhammad Ali was part of the group that forced him out. So it's fascinating. But at any rate, what happened is he met them. Buckley, although he was an intellectual, was not a huge reader. He read very slowly. I sympathize with that. I'm a slow reader. But he was a great listener. He was a pretty good musician. Not as he really wanted to be a concert pianist. He wasn't anywhere near good enough to do that. But he was a great music appreciator. And there's a kind of musical quality to his speech and writing if you listen closely. He loved music. So when he met a good talker, he was all ears. And he went on a tour. He was invited, more power to the National Urban League, props to them, because they were a civil rights organization that invited journalists in 1969, right after Richard Nixon had been elected, a period of great civil unrest in the U.S., to tour what was then called the inner city ghetto in 8 cities across the country. And Buckley was invited, and he went along. First thing, he went. He wanted to meet. They said to him, you're not going to eat in fancy restaurants. You're going to stay in the homes of ordinary citizens in the inner city, and you're going to meet community leaders. And Buckley was just astounded. Who are these people? They're so smart. They're so educated. They've taught themselves all these things, right? And today, again, it can sound condescending, but I talked to a guy who was on that tour with Buckley, and he was impressed. He said, what's he doing there? He was there. He wanted to hear what people had to say. And when they went to Chicago, he met the very young and charismatic organizer, Jesse Jackson, who was then in his late 20s, mid to late 20s. Buckley's knocked out by him. Says, oh, you've got to come to New York. You have to meet my colleagues at National Review. Like the famous elder at the magazine, James Burnham, the political theorist, who was far more of a racist, by the way, than Bill Buckley. And then Buckley puts him on firing line, and you can see it. You can see Jackson and his dashiki, during this debate. And then it's just because he was interested. He was curious. He would say to you, so who are you? What do you believe? He didn't care what your background was, whether you were rich or poor. He wanted to know what you thought, where you stood. And Jackson, he realizes, is saying something he hasn't heard before. And the phrase used back then was black capitalism. Jackson is saying, help us. Help us give us some money, and we will put that money to use. Yeah, we can't generate it ourselves. We just don't have the wherewithal. But if you give us some money, we'll make something happen with it. And Buckley thinks, you know what? That might work. He's for that. In fact, Nixon was for that. So Buckley starts listening, and then he thinks, oh man, that stuff I was saying about how black people can't vote, he said, that's pretty bad. So he writes an article in Life magazine, and then he does an interview with Playboy magazine. It will surprise people. Playboy was a very distinguished sort of magazine.
Oh, you wanted to be the celebrity Playboy interview.
Yeah, he was he more than once. And Bill Buckley in 1970 says, I'll tell you what we need. We need a black president in this country in 1980. And he died 6 months, 2008, before Barack Obama got the nomination. What would he have made of Barack Obama? To me, that's a very interesting question because Barack Obama is a really good writer, really good talker, all the things Buckley liked. He has that kind of poise and charisma that's very interesting to Buckley. And Buckley's only biological child, his son Christopher Buckley, very accomplished and well-known novelist and humor writer in the U.S., voted for Barack Obama in 2008.
Yeah, and some controversy around that.
Some controversy, got driven out of National Review because of that. So it's very, very interesting when you do Buckley and race. So you look at it and you think, okay, this is how people change. And if you're a die-hard ideologue, you say, oh, well, you just like Buckley because his views on race became softer and more accommodating. And so I think, well, what's wrong with that exactly? He's taking the measure of the real world he's living in. He came out of a place, not just his childhood, Brian, but the intellectual world that created him, these very impassioned ex-communists who in some ways remain Bolsheviks at heart, like Whittaker Chambers was one of them. They still see the world in apocalyptic terms. Buckley's not really that apocalyptic. He sees it more in strategic terms. And the strategic thinking says, well, maybe we can pull some of those people over to our side. Remember, Ronald Reagan was very pro-immigration, right? He would say, well, they're Democrats now, but once they start making money, they'll all turn into Republicans, which kind of turned out to be true if you look at some of Donald Trump's numbers.
I was in Arizona just before the election last year. And
I mean, who's with him on? It's surprising who's with him on a lot of the
Latino men voted for Donald Trump in big numbers.
Black men too, and much bigger numbers than we've seen in a long time, because they feel they're a part, rightly or wrongly, of whatever world they think he's creating. There's an aspirational aspect to all of this politics that I think we sometimes forget. And Buckley's got that. Buckley was much more better acquainted with the middle class and the working class than people realized because he'd grown up in the Catholic Church. And even though his own family had this almost kind of Spanish counter-Reformation style high church Catholicism, they still went to the local church. And I've seen that church in the town of Sharon, Connecticut, where he was raised. The beautiful old churches are the Episcopal and the Congregational Church, that's Connecticut. It's a Protestant state. But you have to go around the corner to kind of a side street to see the very modest little brick church where the Catholics worshiped. And that's where the Buckleys went, alongside whom? The groomsmen who were working in the stables, the mechanics who were fixing people's cars, the gardeners and the lawn workers, people who used to work in the factories when they still had them in Connecticut. That's who Buckley knows in some way are his actual constituency. That was not easy for him to reconcile himself to, by the way. He didn't like the idea that his politics had this populist aspect, but he was shrewd enough to understand that it did, that's where the votes were coming from. He never really reconciled himself to it, but he was smart enough to see that's how it worked. What was then called the backlash politics, and in his era, was really where the Republican Party was finding its support.
Well, Sam, I could keep talking to you for hours, I think, but I do encourage people to read the book because you brought out all sides of William Buckley, and he seemed like a larger-than-life character, and that's from my far-off perch, and that's what you've presented here. So thank you very much for the book. I appreciate it.
Oh, it was so much fun talking to you, Brian.
Full Comment is a post-media podcast. My name's Brian Lilly, your host. This episode was produced by Andre Proulx. Theme music by Bryce Hall. Kevin Libin is the executive producer. Please remember to hit subscribe, whether you're on Apple, Spotify, wherever you're listening. Hit the subscribe button. Help us out by leaving a review, telling your friends about us. Until next time, I'm Brian Lilly. Thanks for listening.
Here's that clip from Canada Did What? I Promised You.
So, although abortion was sort of accessible, it really wasn't.
But then 1988 rolls around. And what's the law on abortion then? Suddenly, there wasn't one. Literally no restrictions existed in 1988. Abortion went from heavily restricted to completely unrestricted almost overnight. There was no referendum on this. There wasn't even an act of parliament. This whole thing is due to a somewhat surprise decision out of the Supreme Court of Canada. And it came about in large part because of one man, a Canadian doctor who had been relentless about running illegal abortion clinics since the 1960s and was determined to overturn the laws prohibiting the practice. Along the way, he endured multiple arrests, constant raids, a jail term, a firebombing of his clinic, an attack by a fanatic wielding garden shears, the approbation of virtually his entire profession, and frequent death threats. If you want to hear the rest of the story, make sure you subscribe to Canada Did What? Everywhere you get your podcasts.